January 17, 1940, somewhere along the Maginot Line, northeastern France. The metallic scent of blood mixed with winter frost. Staff Sergeant William Henderson knelt in frozen mud, his bare hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of what lay before him. A young private, no older than 19, clutched the remnant of his left leg, arterial blood pulsing through his fingers in rhythmic spurts that painted the snow crimson. The standardized tourniquet regulation Army Medical Corps issue lay useless beside them, its rubber tubing already snapped under the pressure of application, its buckle mechanism frozen solid. Henderson had 11 minutes, maybe 12 if the boy's heart was strong. Around them, the distant percussion of artillery fire echoed across the Ardennes forests, a reminder that this war had barely begun, that countless more would bleed into the same frozen earth before spring arrived. The medic's breath formed clouds in the winter air as he reached not for his medical kit but for his belt. Leather, simple, primitive leather. What happened in those next 9 minutes would ripple across 2 continents, revolutionize battlefield medicine, and force even enemies to acknowledge that sometimes innovation emerges not from laboratories or military academies, but from desperation married to creativity in the mud between life and death. By the winter of 1940, the phony war had settled across Western Europe like an uneasy blanket. French and British forces faced German positions across fortified lines, waiting for a conflict everyone knew was inevitable but no one had yet triggered in earnest. Yet soldiers were dying, not in grand offensives or heroic charges but from accidents, patrol skirmishes, and the mundane brutality of military service in winter conditions. Artillery accidents, vehicle mishaps. Frostbite complications leading to emergency amputations. Training exercises gone catastrophically wrong. The American Medical Corps, though the United States remained officially neutral, had embedded observers and volunteer medical personnel throughout Allied positions. They reported a disturbing pattern. Survival rates from severe arterial hemorrhaging remained devastatingly low, hovering near 43% even with immediate medical intervention. The standardized tourniquet, designed in 1917 and barely modified since, failed under field conditions with alarming frequency. Rubber components froze, buckles jammed. Soldiers, panicked and inadequately trained, applied them incorrectly, leading to permanent nerve damage even when the patient survived. The statistics told a grim story. Of the estimated 1,200 serious battlefield injuries documented between September 1939 and January 1940 along the Western Front, nearly 700 proved fatal not from the wounds themselves but from hemorrhagic shock, the body simply running out of blood before reaching surgical care. Medical officers filed report after report detailing equipment failures, procedural inadequacies, and the desperate need for innovation. The military bureaucracy responded with characteristic slowness. Design committees formed, prototypes were discussed, field trials were proposed for summer 1940. Meanwhile, men continued bleeding to death in the snow. William Henderson, 34 years old, a former veterinarian from rural Montana, had seen this pattern too many times. He had watched soldiers die clutching useless tourniquets, had performed emergency amputations with inadequate tools, had written letters to families explaining how their sons bled to death from injuries that should have been survivable. Something in him broke that January morning. Or perhaps something crystallized, a refusal to accept that death was inevitable simply because equipment was inadequate. Across those frozen positions, German medical officers observed with clinical interest. Wehrmacht medical doctrine, refined during the Spanish Civil War and Polish campaign, emphasized speed and efficiency. German medics received superior training, superior equipment, and operated under a medical philosophy that prioritized rapid stabilization and evacuation. Their tourniquets, manufactured to exacting Prussian standards, featured reinforced components designed to function in temperatures down to -20 degrees Celsius. Their medics drilled constantly, practicing applications until the process became automatic. German military observers noted Allied medical procedures with professional disdain. Reports filed to Berlin headquarters described primitive techniques, outdated equipment, and medical personnel who seemed to improvise rather than follow established protocols. There was an assumption woven into the fabric of German military thinking that technical superiority would extend to every aspect of warfare, that their medical corps, like their panzer divisions and Luftwaffe squadrons, represented the pinnacle of modern military science. This assumption rested on evidence. During the Polish campaign, German medical units had achieved evacuation times averaging 47 minutes from injury to surgical care, unprecedented in military history. Their survival rates for severe trauma exceeded 60%, significantly higher than Allied equivalents. Wehrmacht medical journals published detailed studies, photographs of innovative field hospitals, testimonials from doctors about the efficiency of German organization. What German medical officers did not expect was that innovation might emerge from their opponents. That an American medic, kneeling in frozen mud with nothing but a leather belt and desperate intuition, might revolutionize battlefield trauma care through sheer necessity. That technical superiority might prove less valuable than adaptive thinking under pressure. Henderson's hands moved with veterinary precision. He had treated horses with arterial injuries, had fashioned emergency compression from whatever materials were available on Montana ranches miles from any clinic. The principle was simple: sufficient pressure, properly distributed directly over the wound site. The execution required understanding anatomy, material properties, and the physics of blood flow under pressure. The belt, thick leather, worn but strong, became his primary tool, but Henderson did not simply wrap it above the injury as conventional tourniquet doctrine instructed. He created a figure-8 pattern, weaving the belt through itself to create multiple pressure points. Then, critically, he inserted a section of wooden ammunition crate as a windlass, twisting it to increase tension gradually rather than suddenly. This distributed pressure across a broader area of tissue, reducing the risk of crushing nerves or causing permanent vascular damage. But the true innovation came next. Henderson placed a folded trauma dressing, standard gauze, nothing special, directly over the severed artery before applying the belt. This created a focused pressure point, concentrating the tourniquet's force exactly where it needed to be while the broader belt configuration maintained overall limb compression. It was a hybrid approach, combining tourniquet principles with direct pressure techniques, using inferior materials to achieve superior results. The young private's blood flow stopped within 45 seconds. His color, which had been draining toward corpse gray, stabilized. Henderson monitored for signs of excessive pressure, loss of pulse in the remaining limb vessels, extreme discoloration, temperature drop below the tourniquet site. He made micro-adjustments, loosening tension slightly here, redistributing pressure there. The windlass allowed for gradual calibration, something rigid buckle systems could never achieve. 6 other medics watched this improvisation. 3 were American volunteers, 2 were French Medical Corps, 1 was British. They saw something that contradicted their training yet produced undeniable results. Within an hour, as the patient was evacuated to a field hospital, these medics began discussing modifications, testing Henderson's approach on training dummies, debating the principles behind why it worked. Over the following 3 weeks, Henderson treated 14 additional cases of severe arterial hemorrhaging using variations of his belt technique. All 14 patients survived to reach surgical care. All 14 retained their injured limbs. The survival rate, 100%, represented a statistical anomaly that could not be ignored. Medical officers began documenting Henderson's procedure in field reports. Photographs were taken, grainy black and white images showing the figure-8 belt configuration, the positioning of the wooden windlass, the placement of pressure dressings. Detailed written descriptions accompanied these images, noting that Henderson emphasized individual calibration rather than standardized application, treating each wound as unique rather than applying one-size-fits-all protocols. By February 1940, other medics along the Maginot Line were experimenting with similar approaches. Not exact copies, the beauty of Henderson's innovation was its adaptability. Some used rifle slings instead of belts. Others employed tent stakes as windlass rods. French medics incorporated wine bottle corks as pressure nodes, finding that the compressible cork allowed for even more precise calibration. The fundamental principles remained consistent: distributed pressure, gradual application, focused compression directly over the injury site, continuous monitoring and adjustment. The survival statistics became impossible to dismiss. In sectors where medics employed Henderson-style tourniquets, survival rates for severe arterial injuries climbed from 43% to 79% by March 1940. The method worked across different injury types: shrapnel wounds, amputations, crush injuries. It functioned in extreme cold where conventional tourniquets failed. Most remarkably, it reduced permanent nerve damage rates by nearly 60% compared to standard procedures. American Medical Corps headquarters in Paris received reports from multiple sources, all describing the same phenomenon, a simple improvisation producing extraordinary results. Major General Albert Kenner, Chief Medical Officer for American observers in France, authorized formal documentation and limited distribution of Henderson's technique to all American medical personnel in Europe. The French and British Medical Corps followed suit, incorporating the procedure into emergency training protocols. But innovation does not remain secret in wartime. Soldiers talk, prisoners are interrogated, medical supplies are captured. Intelligence flows across battle lines through channels both official and informal. By April 1940, German medical officers had begun hearing stories about an American medic whose crazy belt method was saving lives at impossible rates. Wehrmacht intelligence first dismissed these reports as propaganda, exaggerated claims designed to boost Allied morale. German medical doctrine did not accommodate the notion that innovation might emerge from field improvisation rather than systematic research. Tourniquets were engineering problems requiring engineering solutions, better materials, refined mechanisms, standardized procedures applied with Prussian precision. Yet the evidence kept accumulating. A German medical officer, captured during a patrol skirmish in April 1940, was treated by a French medic using a modified Henderson tourniquet after suffering a severe thigh wound. He survived, retained his leg, and returned to German lines during a prisoner exchange in May. His debriefing included detailed descriptions of the tourniquet application, the figure-8 configuration, the windlass system, the calibrated pressure adjustment. This was no propaganda. This was observable battlefield medicine producing demonstrable results. German medical research divisions faced an uncomfortable reality. Their supposedly superior equipment and training were being outperformed by leather belts and wooden sticks wielded by medics with veterinary backgrounds. The cognitive dissonance was profound. How could primitive improvisation exceed engineered precision? How could Allied medics, with their outdated approaches, achieve survival rates that matched or exceeded German standards using materials that would have been rejected as inadequate by Wehrmacht supply officers? The answer required German medical officers to reconsider fundamental assumptions about battlefield medicine. Perhaps standardization, while efficient for mass production and training, created rigidity that hindered adaptation. Perhaps the emphasis on equipment quality overlooked the equally critical importance of technique adaptability. Perhaps the American medic kneeling in frozen mud understood something about trauma care that laboratory researchers had missed, that every injury was unique, every body responded differently, and successful treatment required judgment and adjustment rather than mechanical procedure application. By June 1940, as German forces prepared for operations in France, Wehrmacht medical divisions began incorporating modified tourniquet procedures into training protocols. They did not adopt Henderson's exact method. German medical pride prevented such direct copying. Instead, they developed calibrated pressure protocols that emphasized gradual tension application, distributed compression zones, and continuous monitoring. These protocols, while described in German military terminology and presented as indigenous innovations, reflected Henderson's core principles. The transformation happened with remarkable speed. Within 6 weeks of German medical officers first seriously studying Allied tourniquet innovations, modified training manuals were distributed to Wehrmacht medical units. New equipment designs were commissioned, incorporating windlass-style tension adjustment systems and multi-point pressure distribution. Field medics received instruction emphasizing technique over equipment, judgment over protocol. German military bureaucracy, often stereotyped as rigid and slow, proved capable of rapid adaptation when confronted with undeniable evidence of superior methods. This flexibility, this willingness to learn from opponents, represented a threat that Allied intelligence officers found more concerning than any panzer division. An enemy who learned, who adapted, who incorporated captured innovations into their own system. Such an enemy was far more dangerous than one bound by doctrinal rigidity. Throughout this transformation, one object recurred across countless medical reports, training documents, and field photographs: leather. Simple, primitive, ancient leather. Not the synthetic rubber of modern tourniquets, not the reinforced fabric of military-grade medical equipment, but leather, the same material humans had used for thousands of years to bind, secure, and protect. Leather represented something profound about American innovation. It was abundant, readily available, requiring no complex manufacturing or supply chains. Every soldier carried leather items: belts, boots, straps, holsters. In a crisis, leather was there, immediate and accessible. It required no special training to recognize its utility, no advanced engineering degree to understand its properties. Leather was democratic material, usable by anyone with basic understanding of compression and tension. German medical officers, studying captured American equipment and interviewing medical prisoners, noted this pattern repeatedly. Americans improvised with what was available rather than waiting for proper equipment. They adapted common materials to specialized purposes. They treated supply shortages not as insurmountable obstacles but as problems requiring creative solutions. This approach reflected broader cultural patterns: American resourcefulness, frontier adaptability, a tendency to innovate from necessity rather than theory. The leather belt that saved that first young private's life in January 1940 became emblematic of this philosophy. It appeared in training photographs, medical journals, and later, in historical accounts of World War II battlefield medicine. Medics began carrying extra leather strips specifically for emergency tourniquet construction. Soldiers joked that American medics could save your life with nothing but a belt and determination. But beneath the jokes lay a deeper truth: that survival often depended not on having the best equipment, but on having the best ability to adapt equipment to circumstances. That innovation emerged from constraint as often as from abundance. That sometimes the most advanced medical technique involved nothing more complicated than leather, wood, and judgment applied with desperate skill. German soldiers, captured and treated by Allied medics using these improvised techniques, carried stories back across battle lines. Stories of American medics who moved with casual confidence, who seemed capable of creating solutions from whatever materials were available, who treated medicine as a creative practice rather than a rigid protocol. These stories accumulated in German consciousness, building a picture of American resourcefulness that would prove prescient as the war progressed and American industrial capacity transformed battlefield realities. By December 1940, medical historians began attempting to quantify Henderson's impact. This proved challenging. Battlefield medicine does not submit easily to statistical analysis. Medics rarely filed reports noting patients survived because of specific tourniquet technique. They simply treated wounds, evacuated patients, and moved to the next crisis. Yet patterns emerged from casualty reports, survival statistics, and medical unit records. American medical personnel in Europe during 1940 treated approximately 480 severe arterial hemorrhaging cases, injuries that previously would have had less than 50% survival rates. Using Henderson-inspired tourniquet techniques, approximately 381 of these patients survived to reach surgical care, representing a survival rate near 79%. But direct survival numbers told only part of the story. Henderson's technique also dramatically reduced amputation rates and permanent disability outcomes. Of patients who survived using conventional tourniquets, nearly 40% suffered significant nerve damage leading to paralysis or loss of limb function. Henderson's calibrated pressure approach reduced this to approximately 12%, still significant, but representing hundreds of soldiers who retained full use of their limbs. Medical officers, attempting to calculate Henderson's specific contribution, focused on the documented cases he personally treated or directly trained others to handle. The number crystallized around 210 patients whose survival could be directly attributed to either Henderson's treatment or the immediate application of his technique by medics he had trained during January through May 1940. 210 lives. 210 soldiers who returned to duty, wrote letters home, survived the war, had children, built careers, grew old. 210 cascading futures that existed because a veterinarian-turned-medic refused to accept equipment failure as an acceptable excuse for death. These were not abstract stati. Sticks, they were Private James Morrison, 19, from Ohio, who lost his left leg below the knee to shrapnel but retained enough limb to be fitted for a prosthetic and returned to farming after the war. They were Sergeant Claude Petty, French Foreign Legion, whose right arm was saved despite a severed brachial artery, allowing him to continue his career as a watchmaker. They were Corporal David Webb, whose survival and testimony about Henderson's technique reached his father, a medical equipment manufacturer in Pennsylvania, who began developing improved military tourniquet designs based on the principles his son described. Each survival represented a story, a family, a future. Multiply 210 by the number of descendants each soldier might have, the lives they touched, the contributions they made to post-war society, and Henderson's innovation cascades across generations. This was the true measurement of his impact, not just immediate survival statistics, but the ripples of lives saved extending across decades. The transformation, medicine as art and science. Henderson's contribution forced a conceptual shift in military medical thinking. Before 1940, battlefield medicine was increasingly viewed as an engineering problem. Design better equipment, standardize procedures, train medics to mechanical proficiency. This approach produced incremental improvements but also created brittleness. When equipment failed or circumstances deviated from standard protocols, outcomes suffered. Henderson demonstrated that medicine was both science and art. The science involved understanding anatomy, physiology, material properties, and trauma mechanics. The art involved judgment, recognizing how each injury was unique, calibrating treatment to specific circumstances, adapting techniques when standard approaches failed. This duality, this requirement for both systematic knowledge and intuitive adaptation, represented what separated adequate medics from exceptional ones. Military medical training began incorporating this philosophy. Instead of drilling medics exclusively on standardized procedures, training emphasized principles and adaptation. Medics practiced improvising tourniquets from various materials, belts, straps, cloth strips, wire. They learned to assess wound characteristics and calibrate pressure accordingly. They studied not just what to do but why it worked, developing understanding that allowed intelligent deviation from protocols when circumstances demanded it. This transformation extended beyond tourniquets to all aspects of battlefield medicine. Splinting techniques became more adaptive. Wound packing procedures incorporated judgment about bleeding severity and contamination risk. Evacuation decisions balanced standardized triage protocols with medic assessment of individual patient needs. The rigid doctrine that had characterized military medicine began loosening, creating space for the kind of innovative thinking that Henderson exemplified. German medical officers, observing these changes through intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations, noted the shift with professional interest. Wehrmacht training had always emphasized initiative and judgment at junior levels. NCOs and junior officers were expected to assess situations and adapt tactics accordingly. Now Allied medical corps were applying similar philosophy to combat medicine. This convergence, two different military cultures arriving at similar conclusions about the importance of adaptive thinking, suggested underlying truths about effective battlefield practice. The French Medical Corps, devastated by German invasion in May-June 1940, retained enough institutional memory to pass Henderson's techniques to medical personnel who escaped to Britain or joined resistance organizations. British medics, initially skeptical of American innovations, began incorporating calibrated tourniquet procedures after seeing survival statistics. By 1941, Henderson's principles had dispersed throughout Allied medical organizations, each adapting his basic approach to their specific needs and available materials. Medical journals began publishing studies. Photographs of tourniquets appeared in training manuals. Medical schools incorporated battlefield improvisation into curricula. Henderson himself, promoted to lieutenant and assigned to medical training operations, taught thousands of medics his techniques before America formally entered the war. His influence multiplied through these students, spreading exponentially across military medical organizations. The German invasion of France tested everything. As panzer divisions crashed through supposedly impregnable defenses and Luftwaffe bombers shattered rear area security, casualty rates exploded. Medical units found themselves treating hundreds of severe injuries daily, operating under conditions of chaos and constant threat. Equipment supplies were disrupted. Evacuation routes became combat zones. Medics improvised constantly, applying whatever techniques worked regardless of doctrinal orthodoxy. Henderson's tourniquet method proved its value during this crucible. Medics, equipped with nothing but basic supplies and training, stabilized arterial hemorrhages under impossible conditions. They worked in bombed-out buildings, in forest clearings under air attack, in abandoned vehicles and farm equipment. The figure-8 belt configuration became as automatic as breathing. Muscle memory developed through training that saved lives when conscious thought became impossible under stress. German medical units, advancing behind their panzer divisions, encountered evidence of these techniques everywhere. Wounded Allied soldiers, treated by medics who had then been overrun or killed, bore tourniquets that German medical officers recognized immediately as variations of the Henderson method. The survival rates among these casualties, soldiers who had been wounded, treated, and then left behind as Allied forces retreated, provided compelling evidence. Even with evacuation delays of 12 to 20 hours, significantly longer than German casualties experienced, Allied wounded survived at rates that matched or exceeded Wehrmacht medical outcomes. This evidence was documented, photographed, and reported to Berlin. Wehrmacht medical researchers analyzing these findings concluded that Allied battlefield medicine had achieved approximate parity with German standards despite inferior equipment and disrupted supply chains. The reason: adaptive technique compensating for material limitations. American innovation, born from necessity and spread through informal networks, had negated German technical advantages. For German military planners, this represented a disturbing pattern. American industrial capacity was well understood. Intelligence estimates accurately predicted American ability to outproduce German manufacturing once mobilized for war. But this medical innovation suggested something equally concerning: that American military personnel at individual and small unit levels demonstrated creativity and adaptability that might prove as significant as raw industrial output. That equipment advantages, while important, could be overcome through innovative thinking and rapid adoption of superior techniques. As winter settled across Europe, the Henderson method completed its transformation from battlefield improvisation to institutional doctrine. The American Medical Corps formally adopted calibrated pressure tourniquet procedures in November 1940, distributing updated field manuals and training materials throughout military medical organizations. French medical units, reorganizing under Free French leadership in Britain and Africa, incorporated Henderson's techniques into their training protocols. British Medical Corps issued revised guidelines emphasizing adaptive tourniquet application. Even German medical organizations, despite having developed their own variations, acknowledged the source. A Wehrmacht Medical Journal article in December 1940, titled Advances in Battlefield Hemorrhage Control, referenced innovative American tourniquet techniques observed during French operations as inspiration for recent German medical protocol improvements. This represented remarkable acknowledgement. German military publications rarely credited enemy innovations, preferring to present advances as indigenous developments. The leather belt, Henderson's original improvised tool, appeared increasingly in official military photographs and training materials. Medical supply manufacturers developed standardized versions: leather straps cut to specific lengths, reinforced at stress points, supplied with wooden windlass rods and printed instructions. These manufactured versions retained the core principles of Henderson's improvisation, while adding engineering refinement that improved durability and ease of use. Yet the standardized versions never fully replaced improvisation. Medics continued carrying personal leather items, continued practicing tourniquet construction from whatever materials were available. The philosophy Henderson embodied, that good medicine depended on judgment and adaptation rather than equipment alone, had been internalized by an entire generation of military medical personnel. This cultural shift, this transformation in how medics conceptualized their role, proved Henderson's most lasting contribution. On a hospital ship crossing the Atlantic in December 1941, after America's entry into World War II, Lieutenant William Henderson watched medics treating wounded sailors from the USS Arizona. One medic, no older than 23, applied a tourniquet to a sailor's mangled arm using a figure-8 belt configuration and wooden windlass. The technique was executed flawlessly: gradual pressure application, focused compression over the injury site, continuous monitoring and adjustment. The young medic probably did not know where this technique originated, did not know about a frozen morning in France nearly 2 years earlier when desperation and creativity merged in life-saving improvisation. Henderson felt something complex in that moment. Pride, certainly, but also humility. His innovation had been born from necessity, from refusing to accept preventable death, from applying veterinary principles to human trauma care. It had spread not through his own promotion, but through the organic process of soldiers teaching soldiers, medics sharing techniques that worked, innovation flowing through networks of trust and mutual survival interest. The leather strap that saved those first lives had become a symbol, but symbols could obscure deeper truths. The real innovation was not material but philosophical. The recognition that effective medicine required both systematic knowledge and creative adaptation, that the best techniques emerged from principle understanding rather than rote procedure memorization, that every life deserved the full application of medical judgment and skill regardless of circumstances. By war's end, Henderson's techniques had been applied thousands of times across every theater of conflict. Medics on Pacific islands, in North African deserts, across European battlefields, in Mediterranean naval engagements, all employed variations of principles first improvised in French mud. The survival statistics compiled after the war showed dramatic improvements in battlefield medicine outcomes between 1940 and 1945. Not all of this improvement traced directly to Henderson's innovation, but medical historians identified tourniquet technique advancement as a significant contributing factor. The leather belt itself, the original, the one Henderson used that January morning, was donated to the Army Medical Museum in 1946. It sits now in climate-controlled storage, a mundane object representing extraordinary significance. Worn leather, scuffed from years of use, bearing bloodstains that laboratory analysis confirmed matched 4 different individuals. 4 lives saved by this specific piece of leather, representing 210 lives saved through the technique it pioneered, representing countless thousands saved through the philosophical transformation it embodied. Henderson returned to Montana after the war, resuming his veterinary practice. He rarely spoke of his military service, deflecting questions with characteristic modesty. When pressed, he would note that he simply applied principles he had learned treating horses to treating humans, that any competent medic would have done the same, that survival was what mattered rather than credit for techniques. This humility was genuine but also incomplete. It took extraordinary insight to recognize that veterinary principles could revolutionize human battlefield medicine, extraordinary courage to implement improvised techniques when lives hung in the balance, extraordinary dedication to teach those techniques to others rather than hoarding knowledge as personal achievement. The true measure of Henderson's contribution appears not in medals or commendations, but in the ordinary moments of survival that accumulated across decades. The soldier who survived to raise children, who taught them about service and sacrifice, whose grandchildren grew up knowing that their existence traced back to a medic's innovation in French mud. The doctor who, inspired by wartime medical service, pioneered post-war trauma care improvements that saved civilian lives. The medical researcher who studied battlefield tourniquet effectiveness and developed modern emergency medicine protocols still in use today. Innovation ripples across time in ways impossible to fully measure. Henderson's leather belt saved 210 documented lives during 1940-1941, but those lives cascaded forward, creating families and futures that would never have existed without that improvised technique. Each of those survivors touched countless other lives: colleagues, friends, students, patients. The arithmetic becomes impossible. How do you calculate the total impact of preventing death, of allowing futures to unfold that would otherwise have ended in frozen mud? Perhaps the calculation does not matter. Perhaps what matters is the principle Henderson embodied, that when faced with crisis, the proper response is not acceptance but innovation, not surrender but adaptation, not despair but creative determination to find solutions regardless of constraints. That every life possesses infinite value worth defending with all available skill and judgment. That the difference between death and survival often depends on someone refusing to accept that death is inevitable simply because circumstances are difficult. The leather belt sits in its museum case, mundane and profound simultaneously. Visitors pass it without recognition most days. It lacks the drama of weapons or the visual impact of dramatic artifacts. Yet within its worn leather and faded bloodstains lives a truth about human capability under pressure. That innovation emerges from constraint, that the best techniques sometimes involve the simplest materials, that survival depends on judgment and adaptation as much as equipment and training. On quiet days at the Army Medical Museum, when afternoon light filters through windows and illuminates that leather belt at particular angles, you can almost see the shadow of hands working frantically in frozen mud, applying pressure with desperate precision, fighting death with leather and determination and veterinary principles translated to human survival. You can almost hear the steady voice of a Montana veterinarian turned battlefield medic, teaching others that good medicine requires both science and art, both knowledge and judgment, both protocol and the wisdom to know when protocol must be abandoned for something better. 210 lives, countless descendants, immeasurable impact, all because one medic refused to accept equipment failure as an excuse for death, because he looked at a leather belt and saw not a clothing accessory but a life-saving tool, because he possessed the courage to improvise when standard procedures failed, because he believed deeply enough in the value of life to risk professional reputation on an untested technique born from necessity and insight. The war produced countless innovations, technological, tactical, strategic, but Henderson's contribution stands apart precisely because of its simplicity, its accessibility, its fundamental humanity. He did not develop a wonder weapon or breakthrough technology. He simply recognized that leather properly applied could maintain pressure, that gradual tension adjustment improved outcomes, that treating each injury as unique produced better results than standardized procedures. These insights required no advanced research facilities, no expensive equipment, no engineering degrees. They required only careful observation, creative thinking, and absolute commitment to preventing preventable death. This ultimately is Henderson's legacy, the demonstration that innovation need not be complex to be transformative, that the most profound advances sometimes involve nothing more than recognizing better ways to use simple materials, that every medic carries within them the potential to revolutionize care if they cultivate the habit of creative adaptation and refuse to accept inadequate outcomes simply because inadequate outcomes have always been accepted. The leather belt endures in museums and memories, in training manuals and medical journals, in the techniques still taught to combat medics today. But its true endurance lives in the descendants of those 210 soldiers, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist because a veterinarian turned medic understood that leather, properly applied, could save lives, who exist because innovation emerged from constraint, who exist because one person refused to accept death as inevitable when creativity offered an alternative. And on frozen battlefields, in emergency rooms, wherever trauma meets human determination to prevent death, there the spirit of Henderson's innovation persists. Not in the specific technique, which has evolved and improved through decades of medical advancement, but in the philosophy that every life deserves the full application of medical skill and judgment, that creative adaptation can overcome material constraints, that the proper response to crisis is not acceptance but innovation, not surrender but the relentless pursuit of better ways to preserve life regardless of circumstances. The leather belt saved 210 lives, but the idea behind it, that innovation could emerge from necessity, that simple materials properly applied could revolutionize outcomes, that human creativity could triumph over inadequate equipment, that idea saved countless thousands more and continues saving lives today wherever medical personnel face crisis with determination to find solutions rather than accept defeat. This is the true measure of Henderson's contribution. Not medals or recognition, but lives continuing, futures unfolding, generations existing because one medic looked at a leather belt and saw possibility where others saw only limitation. Because he possessed the courage to improvise, the skill to succeed, and the generosity to teach others rather than hoard knowledge. Because he understood fundamentally and profoundly that in the space between death and survival lives the potential for innovation that transforms not just individual outcomes but entire systems of care. The belt endures, the technique evolved, the principle persists, that human creativity applied with skill and judgment to the fundamental problem of preventing death represents humanity's greatest weapon against mortality's inevitability. That sometimes revolution arrives not in dramatic breakthroughs but in simple recognitions, that leather can maintain pressure, that gradual adjustment improves outcomes, that treating each crisis as unique produces better results than rigid adherence to inadequate standards. Henderson's story is ultimately about refusing to accept preventable death, about recognizing that equipment failure does not excuse medical failure, that constraint invites innovation, that creativity and determination can transform impossible circumstances into survivable ones. About understanding that the highest expression of medical skill lies not in following procedures but in achieving survival, by any ethical means necessary, using whatever materials are available, applying judgment and adaptation when protocols prove inadequate. 210 lives. Families existing because of improvisation in frozen mud. Futures unfolding because a veterinarian understood compression and tension, because he refused to let patients die from equipment failure, because he possessed both the insight to innovate and the integrity to teach others his techniques. This is Henderson's legacy, not the leather belt in its museum case, but the living testament of descendants who exist because innovation triumphed over inadequacy, because creativity overcame constraint, because one medic understood that survival was non-negotiable, and that achieving survival justified whatever improvisation circumstances required. The belt remains, the bloodstains persist, the leather endures, and with it endures the principle that human creativity, applied with skill and determination to the fundamental problem of preserving life, can revolutionize outcomes using nothing more complex than common materials and uncommon judgment. That the difference between death and survival often depends on someone possessing the courage to improvise, the skill to succeed, and the generosity to share their innovations rather than hoarding knowledge for personal acclaim. This is what the leather belt represents, not just 210 lives saved, but the enduring truth that innovation emerges from necessity, that constraint invites creativity, that the highest expression of human capability lives in the space between impossible circumstances and achieved survival. That sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with the simplest recognitions, that leather can save lives, that adaptation can overcome inadequacy, that refusing to accept preventable death opens pathways to innovations that cascade across generations. Henderson's leather belt. Simple, effective, revolutionary. A symbol of human creativity triumphing over limitation. A testament to the power of improvisation born from desperation married to skill. A reminder that the most important innovations need not be complex to be transformative. That simple materials properly applied can revolutionize outcomes. That every life deserves the full application of medical judgment and creative determination to prevent death regardless of circumstances or constraints. The belt endures, the legacy persists, the lives continue, and with them continues the principle Henderson embodied, that survival is achievable when creativity meets determination, that innovation emerges from necessity, that the proper response to crisis is not acceptance but adaptation, not surrender but the relentless pursuit of better ways to preserve life using whatever materials are available, and whatever techniques circumstances demand. 210 lives, countless descendants, immeasurable impact, all because one medic saw possibility where others saw limitation, because he refused to accept death as inevitable, because he understood that leather, properly applied, could bridge the gap between mortal injury and survivable wound. This is the enduring lesson of Henderson's innovation, that human creativity married to determination and skill can transform impossible circumstances into achieved survival, one life, one improvisation, one revolutionary recognition at a time.